2023 was an incredible year for gaming, especially RPGs, which is something I never thought I would say. So many great games came out this year, many coming as new entries in long-standing franchises as well. Add to this the fact that I seem to have finally learned how to play good games, and it was actually really tough to make both of my top 5s for the year. Before we get into it, I do need to get out in front of this particular train. Reminder that these lists are made up of games that I actually played this year, and sadly I never got around to the new Zelda or Alan Wake. Another special note is that I did play Jedi Survivor, but the game decided to not save a 5-hour play session. Even though it showed the saving logo many times, I went to the save points, I saved the game, it just didn't want to. And that might have cost it a spot on these lists. But now let's get into the real list. I don't really like roguelikes. They can be fun for a bit, but usually I find that they get old pretty quickly. It just feels like too much of the same thing over and over, without a lot of reason to keep going. Some games do have solid progression, like Rogue Legacy, and those types of games can usually hold my attention a little longer, but they're still usually not the ones for me. Returnal immediately fell off my radar since it was a full AAA $70 release. I can barely spend $20 on these kinds of games. But then it showed up on PlayStation Plus, and I figured, let's give it a whirl. After playing it, I can say that Returnal is the roguelike that was made for me. A game with a narrative built around this idea of infinite and endless runs, with clear progression laid out for the player. Did you unlock the first act's boss, but don't kill him on that run? Don't worry, he's unlocked forever. You just go straight to him now. Made it to the next act? Then don't worry about replaying the previous acts every run. Within the first few rooms, a way to get to the act that you actually made it to. This makes it actually feel like you're progressing in the game. On top of that, the bullet hell third-person gunplay is tight and engaging narrative, lots of interesting upgrades, and a very unique world to explore. This game really is fantastic. It seems we can't get through a year without a new rhythm game making its way onto my top games lists. This year's is HiFi Rush, a third-person action game where you need to time your attacks to the rhythm. The music and soundtrack is fantastic, and it makes for a really fresh game experience. I think the story itself was a little awkward and cringe, which is definitely what they were going for, but for me, intentional cringe is still cringy. I just don't like it. But the gameplay itself is more than strong enough to carry this title over the finish line. By the mid to end game, you've got so many combos and things to keep track of, it can get a little overwhelming to try and fully utilize all the skills available to you, but that's common with games like this. And I think it actually shows that they really did try and make an action game and a rhythm game. Neither of the two genres were compromised on for the other. It really beautifully merges its two genres into a rocking package. Tunic really took me by surprise. The way the game is presented, encouraging exploration, intuition, critical thinking, skills I don't always have, I just loved it when I really didn't expect to. Finding a new page for the manual, realizing that I had an ability since the start of the game, but it's 3/4 into the game, spending 4 hours wondering where to go next because I missed the ladder on the map and didn't see it because it's kind of hidden behind a rock. This game has it all. It really is a journey and an experience and an adventure almost unlike any other I've had in gaming. If you want to hear more, check out my review, but genuinely I think it's best to go into this game as blind as you can and just enjoy the ride. The Pikmin series really came out of nowhere for me this year. I'd always heard about it, but when people would talk about it, it was always described to me as an RTS game, which is a genre I usually stay away from, especially on console where you have to play with a controller. It just never feels like a good control scheme. However, Pikmin 3 Deluxe came out for the Switch and was on sale one day, and so I figured I'd give it a try. And I'm really glad I did. While this particular entry in the list is devoted to 4, I played the entire series this year thanks to the re-releases of 1 and 2 on the Switch as well, and the whole series is just so great. It's more strategy and puzzle game than it is RTS, and it just feels so satisfying to slowly gather up more Pikmin, collect cool treasures, unlock more of the map, fight these fun and interesting monsters. Honestly though, to me, the most amazing thing about this series is how feature-rich it was, even going all the way back to the GameCube games. I played 3 and 4 before I played 1 and 2, so when I played 4, I was so impressed because it felt like they added so much to the series. But then I went back and played the first 2 and realized that 3 was kind of like a soft remake of the first game, and 4 is essentially just a soft remake of the second game. Everything that I thought was new in the 4th game existed in Pikmin 2. It had both the purple and white Pikmin, all the underground caves. It really had everything, and that blew my mind. Really, the only issue with those first 2 games is the pathing of the Pikmin, because man, could those games be frustrating when half your guys just walk into a puddle to drown. Like, why are you doing that, guys? Come on. Pikmin 4 honestly builds upon everything that came before it and presents it in a dense, accessible package that is an absolute joy to play through. So after gushing about the entire Resident Evil series last year, it may surprise you that in the year with the Resident Evil 4 remake, the only Resident Evil game on my list is Resident Evil 8. Don't get me wrong, I did enjoy the remake of 4, but I don't know, there's something special about the original Resident Evil 4 that I felt got lost in translation with the remake, and the remake just didn't grab me as much. Resident Evil 8, on the other hand, is the Resident Evil 4 remake that we deserved. It takes the kind of core concepts of that game, but iterates on them and improves upon them in some ways, and also brings with it the first-person perspective of Resident Evil 7. I absolutely loved this game. I was really surprised too, because it felt like all the discussion I had heard from it was a step down from Resident Evil 7, but personally I thought it was better in almost every way. Each of the game's chapters are unique, bringing a new area for you to explore. Of course, the first, the Castle Dimitrescu, or however you say that, has a lot of callbacks to the original game's mansion. Some of the later stages, the Puppet Maker's house, are just horrifying. Heisenberg's factory with all of its machinery. Each one feels totally unique from the last, and yet at the same time, the game has a very consistent tone and theme throughout. I think Resident Evil 8 really took everything that was new and unique in Resident Evil 7 and iterated on it and refined it to make it a much stronger game. Yes, it's a little more action-oriented, kind of in the same vein as Resident Evil 4, but that doesn't mean it's not tense, that doesn't mean it's not scary. I actually found myself being a little more scared in 8 than I was in 7, which I did not expect. I really loved Resident Evil 8. I think it's an easy top 3 for the series, if not higher, and I can't wait to see what comes next. It's crazy that we're at number 3 for the year, and yet from here on out we've got RPGs for the rest of the list. I really can't believe it. As someone who's always loved RPGs, this year was absolutely stacked. The first Octopath Traveler was such a cool idea. 8 unique characters, each with their own story, an interesting twist on the combat from the Bravely Default games, really cool HD, 2D, retro-looking graphics. But ultimately that game was a bit of a disappointment. The stories all kind of stunk. The game really dragged, especially as you got into the later chapters of each character's story. Octopath 2 fixes pretty much every problem from the first game. The stories are all mostly great, each telling mature tales filled with death and loss and struggle. There's even an epilogue now that includes all 8 characters. And it's not even tacked on. So even though each character's story still only focuses on them and only they show up in the cutscenes, as you're going through their stories, you start seeing these hints and foreshadowing towards this epilogue, towards this overarching narrative that is happening to the world, to the game. And it's really cool as you start piecing everything together, you start seeing that there is something bigger going on than each of these individual stories. And so that final chapter really doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel tacked on. It feels like a natural continuation of this group's story. I also really enjoyed the balancing. They expanded the different characters' stories to have a few more chapters and spaced out the levels a bit so that you really did always have somewhere else to go, and you didn't really have to grind anywhere to get your party caught up. Yes, occasionally you might have one or two characters that fall behind a little bit, but it's not hard to get them caught up, and thanks to the level capping of each of the different chapters, makes for pretty smooth progression through the game as well. Really the only complaint that I have with it is that they didn't iterate on the classes in the game. It's the same 8 classes with, as far as I know, the same skills. It's not the end of the world, since I think all the classes are pretty unique from one another. I think there's a lot of skills to use, and it is fun to mix and match. But it would have been nice to see some iteration on that side of the game as well. As it is, though, it is still a fantastic RPG to play through, and I highly recommend it. I played the first Yakuza game last year and mentioned that I expected to make my way through the series this year. What I didn't expect was such an insane leap from 1 to 2. I absolutely fell in love with Yakuza Kiwami 2. The game just looks incredible and still runs great on the Steam Deck. I guess this one uses the engine from a later game in the series, whereas the remasters of 1, 3, 4, 5 all use an older engine. So the jump was just insane. It's a huge step up from the other remastered games. And there's just so much to do here. These games actually are tough to play back to back because there really is so much extra to do, and a lot of the extras are similar from game to game. And I did it all with this game. All the Majima construction missions, I hosted the crap out of my club, and I became a toy race car champion. The main story is gripping, emotional, impactful, great characters. This game really is the full package. Unfortunately, I wasn't really able to get through more of the series this year as I had hoped, because Yakuza 3 is painfully bad. The combat is so tedious and frustrating, I have really struggled to pick it up more over the year. Hopefully I finally get through it, and will eventually get through the rest of this series, because I do want to see what happens next. Star Ocean's Second Story R is an astounding game, especially when you realize that it's a remake of a 25-year-old game. It is crazy to me how much is in this game, considering the constraints of the consoles back when it released. There is so much content and depth here to the different skills and characters that you can unlock, how you progress through the story, all the side content that you can engage with the different characters in your party. And the remake is phenomenal. Beautiful graphics, it ran perfectly on the Switch. They got rid of random encounters, they added markers that help you clue in on where these potential side stories might be and the additional content, and at its core, it's got a really cool story and combat system. This game, reignited my passion for gaming in a way I really wasn't prepared for and didn't expect at all. I had never played the Star Ocean series before. I just kind of bought into the hype of this one, and I blasted through it in a week, even though it's got a 25 to 30 hour runtime. And this isn't nostalgia talking. I tried playing the first game in preparation for this one before it released, and I couldn't even finish it because that game does have so many relics of older retro game design that just make it clunky to play. Random spikes in difficulties that can wipe you out when you're not expecting it because every other monster you fought in this dungeon or whatever was fine, and then all of a sudden you die and you lose an hour progress. Just frustrating stuff like that. But this remake addresses and modernizes everything, but what's so impressive is it doesn't change anything. The game still feels like a retro game, just as I assume it felt to play all those years ago. It just has some modernization, some quality of life improvements to make it more smooth to play without changing what it was. And to me, this is the gold standard for what a remake should be. Kina, Bridge of Spirits was such an experience. I talked about it in my review, but this was really one of the few games where I had no expectations and was blown away. And on top of that, playing it on the hardest difficulty actually added to the game's experience. It is a beautiful game that delicately deals with loss, grief, and anger, with solid combat and exploration. This game really took me by surprise in all the best ways. And if you want to hear my full thoughts, check out my review. But it was easy to put this game at the top of my list. It feels so unfair to include Balers Gate 3 on this list, because it is so above and beyond any other game I've ever played. It deserves its own category. This is one of those generational games that has completely set the standards for what a game can and should be. The writing, the story, the characters, the acting, the absolute expansiveness of this game is unbelievable. I've never played Dungeons & Dragons because I don't have friends or a social life or time, but this game makes me want to. The sheer number of options you have in dialogue and the way you can approach situations, the things you can do, the different characters you can bring along with you in your party and the way that they affect the story and how you interact with them and the world. There's just so much. It's overwhelming and honestly insane that so much is in this game. I hadn't even made it through the first area of the game, and it already felt like I had played an entire and complete game. What else can you say? This game is an absolute triumph, and I'm so happy to see how widely it has succeeded as well. People who have never played games like this, picking it up and loving it. And to me, that is a true achievement. Give it a shot. This game is really unlike any other that has come before it. And that's it. Another year in the books. What were your games of the year? Let me know in the comments down below. Excited to see what new stuff comes next year. Hard to imagine that we're going to get a better year in gaming than we had this year, but I'm sure we'll still get some bangers. And I will see you all with the next video.